The conference room at Pentagon's third floor buzzed with tension as Colonel Sarah Mitchell approached the heavy oak doors. Her polished black shoes clicked against the marble floor with each determined step, echoing through the corridor lined with portraits of military legends. The morning sun streamed through tall windows, casting long shadows across the hallway where she had walked countless times before, but today felt different. Today, everything would change. Sarah had spent the previous night reviewing classified intelligence reports. Her dining table transformed into a makeshift command center covered with satellite images, communication intercepts, and strategic analyses. The coffee had grown cold hours ago, but she remained focused, knowing that tomorrow's briefing could alter the course of military operations in 3 different theaters. Her expertise in Middle Eastern affairs and counterterrorism had earned her respect among peers, but respect and acceptance were 2 entirely different currencies in the Pentagon's male-dominated hierarchy. The brass nameplate on her desk read, Colonel Sarah Mitchell, Strategic Intelligence Division, but to many of the senior officers she remained an outsider who had climbed too high too fast. Her unconventional path to this position had raised eyebrows throughout her career. Unlike most of her colleagues who followed traditional military trajectories, Sarah had entered the service after completing a doctorate in international relations at Georgetown University. Her academic background, combined with field experience in Iraq and Afghanistan, made her uniquely qualified for strategic intelligence work. Yet some questioned whether a woman could truly understand the complexities of modern warfare. As she reached for the conference room door handle, Sarah's mind raced through the presentation she had prepared. The intelligence she had uncovered painted a disturbing picture of coordinated terrorist activities across multiple continents, with connections that previous analyses had failed to identify. Her team had worked tirelessly for months, following digital breadcrumbs across encrypted communications networks, analyzing financial transactions, and cross-referencing human intelligence reports from assets in 12 different countries. The breakthrough had come 3 weeks earlier, when Sarah noticed an unusual pattern in communication frequencies between known terrorist cells. While other analysts focused on the content of intercepted messages, she had concentrated on timing, frequency, and signal strength variations. Her mathematical approach, influenced by her undergraduate degree in applied mathematics, revealed a coordination system that operated like a sophisticated orchestra, with each cell playing its part in a larger symphony of destruction. Inside the conference room, 5 generals sat around a polished mahogany table that had witnessed decades of crucial military decisions. General Robert Hayes, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, occupied the head position, his weathered face bearing the lines of countless difficult decisions. To his right sat General Patricia Williams, the only other woman in the room, and someone Sarah had hoped would provide support. General Marcus Thompson, known for his traditional views on military hierarchy, drummed his fingers impatiently against the table surface. General David Chen, the youngest of the group at 52, studied his tablet with characteristic intensity. Finally, General James Morrison, whose reputation for explosive temper was legendary throughout the Pentagon, glared at his watch as if willing time to move faster. The room itself spoke of military tradition and power, with its wood-paneled walls displaying medals of honor, battle flags from historic campaigns, and photographs of previous military leaders who had shaped American defense strategy. A large digital display screen dominated one wall, ready to present classified information to those with appropriate clearance levels. The air conditioning hummed quietly, maintaining the cool temperature that kept electronic equipment functioning optimally and minds sharp during lengthy strategic sessions. Sarah entered the room with confident strides, carrying a leather briefcase containing her presentation materials and a secure tablet loaded with classified intelligence data. Her dress blue uniform was immaculate, each ribbon and insignia positioned precisely according to military regulations. She had learned early in her career that attention to detail in appearance often determined whether male colleagues would take her seriously, an unfortunate reality that female officers navigated daily. "Good morning, generals," Sarah began, setting her briefcase on the table and activating the display screen with practiced efficiency. "Thank you for making time in your schedules for this critical intelligence briefing. The information I'm about to present has significant implications for our current operations in the Middle East, North Africa, and Southeast Asia." General Morrison interrupted before she could continue. "Colonel, I'm not sure why you're here. This briefing was supposed to be conducted by General Peterson from Intelligence Command. Are you his secretary taking notes? The question hung in the air like smoke from a battlefield, its implications clear to everyone present. Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks but maintained her professional composure. She had encountered such attitudes throughout her military career, but the blatant disrespect in front of the Joint Chiefs surprised even her. General Peterson had specifically requested that Sarah deliver this briefing due to her expertise and direct involvement in the intelligence gathering process. Sir, General Peterson asked me to present these findings personally because I led the analytical team that uncovered this intelligence network. Sarah replied calmly, her voice steady despite the humiliation burning in her chest. My team and I have spent 18 months tracking these connections, and I have the most comprehensive understanding of the operational details. General Thompson leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms over his chest. Colonel, I appreciate your dedication, but strategic intelligence briefings to the Joint Chiefs require a certain level of experience and perspective that comes with senior leadership positions. Perhaps you could provide your notes to someone more appropriate for this level of discussion. The dismissal was swift and brutal. Sarah watched as General Hayes nodded in agreement, his expression suggesting that he viewed her presence as an administrative error rather than a deliberate decision by Intelligence Command. Even General Williams, whom Sarah had respected as a trailblazer for women in the military, remained silent, neither supporting nor opposing the obvious discrimination unfolding before them. Generals, with respect, the intelligence I've gathered indicates an imminent threat that could result in coordinated attacks against American interests globally. Sarah pressed, knowing that her career might suffer for her persistence, but unwilling to remain silent when lives were at stake. The patterns we've identified suggest a level of organizational sophistication that surpasses anything we've seen from these terrorist networks before. General Chen finally spoke, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to making life-and-death decisions. Colonel Mitchell, your concerns are noted, but we'll review your written reports through proper channels. This briefing is concluded. The dismissal was final and humiliating. Sarah gathered her materials with as much dignity as she could muster, her hands trembling slightly with suppressed anger and frustration. As she walked toward the door, she could hear whispered conversations beginning behind her, no doubt discussing the inappropriate presence of a female colonel in such an important briefing. The door closed behind her with a soft click that seemed to echo like a gunshot in the corridor. Standing alone in the hallway, Sarah leaned against the wall and took deep breaths to control her emotions. 20 years of military service, including combat tours and countless successful operations, had been reduced to secretarial duties in the minds of the most powerful military leaders in the country. The intelligence she carried could prevent significant loss of life, but gender prejudice had created an insurmountable barrier to communication. Her phone buzzed with a text message from her team back at Intelligence Command, asking about the briefing outcome. Sarah stared at the screen, unsure how to explain that the most critical intelligence discovery of her career had been dismissed without consideration because of her gender. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was prevented from protecting her country by the very institution she had sworn to serve. Walking back to her office, Sarah's mind raced with possibilities for getting this intelligence to decision-makers who would take it seriously. The traditional chain of command had failed spectacularly, but there were alternative channels for critical intelligence that bypassed conventional military hierarchy. Her security clearance provided access to communication networks that could reach the highest levels of government, including the National Security Council and the President's daily intelligence briefings. The elevator ride to her floor seemed to last forever, each passing second representing potential preparation time lost by terrorist organizations that continued their planning while American military leadership remained ignorant of their activities. Sarah's reflection in the polished elevator doors showed a professional military officer whose appearance betrayed none of the turmoil brewing beneath the surface. Her uniform remained crisp, her posture military perfect, and her expression composed, but her eyes revealed the determination of someone who had been pushed too far. Her office provided a sanctuary where she could process the morning's events and plan her next moves. The walls displayed her military commendations, including medals for valor in combat and recognition for outstanding service in intelligence operations. Photographs showed her with various military units throughout her career, evidence of the respect she had earned from soldiers and junior officers who had served under her command. Her bookshelf contained volumes on military strategy, intelligence analysis, and counterterrorism, alongside personal mementos from deployments around the world. Sarah sat at her desk and opened the secure communication system that connected her to intelligence networks worldwide. Her fingers paused over the keyboard as she considered the implications of her next actions. Bypassing the Joint Chiefs of Staff to deliver intelligence directly to higher authorities would end her military career, but failing to act might cost American lives. The choice wasn't really a choice at all. As she began typing her first message, Sarah reflected on the path that had brought her to this moment of crisis. Her decision to join the military had been motivated by a desire to serve her country and use her analytical skills to protect American interests. Throughout her career, she had encountered obstacles and prejudices, but she had never imagined that gender discrimination would prevent her from fulfilling her fundamental duty to protect national security. The afternoon sun streamed through her office window, illuminating dust particles that danced in the light, like tiny representations of the chaos surrounding her situation. Outside, the normal rhythm of Pentagon operations continued, with staff officers and enlisted personnel moving through corridors, attending meetings, and processing the endless stream of information that kept American military forces functioning around the world. None of them knew that critical intelligence was being suppressed by institutional prejudice, potentially leaving the nation vulnerable to coordinated terrorist attacks. Sarah's secure phone rang, displaying the number for General Peterson's office. She answered immediately, hoping that her commanding officer had heard about the morning's briefing and was calling to discuss alternative options for sharing the intelligence. Colonel Mitchell. General Peterson's voice carried concern and frustration. I just received a call from General Hayes's office. They said you were disruptive during the briefing and that your intelligence assessments are questionable. What the hell happened in there? The conversation that followed would determine not only Sarah's immediate future, but also whether the intelligence she had gathered would ever reach decision-makers capable of acting on it. As she explained the morning's events to her commanding officer, Sarah realized that her fight was just beginning, and the stakes were higher than her personal career or reputation. About history. Somewhere in the world, terrorist organizations were moving forward with plans that American military leadership refused to acknowledge, and time was running out. 3 days had passed since Sarah's humiliating dismissal from the Joint Chiefs briefing, and the intelligence reports flooding her desk painted an increasingly urgent picture. Each new piece of information confirmed her analysis of coordinated terrorist activities, but the formal channels for sharing this intelligence remained blocked. General Peterson had promised to review alternative options for presenting her findings, but bureaucratic wheels moved slowly while potential threats accelerated rapidly. Sarah arrived at her office before dawn each morning, using the quiet hours to dig deeper into the intelligence patterns she had identified. Her team of 12 analysts worked around the clock, processing information from human intelligence assets, signals intelligence, and satellite reconnaissance. The picture emerging from their collective efforts revealed a terrorist network operating with unprecedented coordination across multiple continents but without access to senior decision-makers. Their discoveries remained trapped within the intelligence command structure. The secure communications center buzzed with activity as intercepted messages arrived from monitoring stations around the world. ERA had developed a systematic approach to analyzing these communications that went beyond traditional intelligence methods. While most analysts focused on translation and content analysis, she had created algorithms that identified patterns in communication timing, frequency modulation, and signal routing that revealed organizational structures invisible to conventional analysis techniques. Her breakthrough methodology had emerged from her doctoral research on network analysis and chaos theory, academic disciplines rarely applied to military intelligence. By treating terrorist communications as nodes in a complex network rather than isolated data points, Sarah could map relationships and hierarchies that traditional intelligence missed entirely. Her approach had successfully predicted 3 previous terrorist operations, leading to preemptive strikes that saved countless lives. The current intelligence painted a disturbing picture of coordinated planning across terrorist cells in 7 different countries. Communication patterns indicated synchronized timing for multiple operations, with preliminary intelligence suggesting targets in major American and European cities. The sophistication level exceeded anything previously observed from these organizations, indicating either significant evolution in their capabilities or assistance from state-sponsored actors. Sarah's office had become a war room, with whiteboards covered in network diagrams, timeline analyses, and threat assessments. Her team worked with the dedication of people who understood that failure meant innocent lives lost, but their efforts were constrained by institutional barriers that prevented their intelligence from reaching operational commanders. The irony was overwhelming. They possessed information that could prevent terrorist attacks, but military prejudice rendered their discoveries useless. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Webb, Sarah's deputy and closest collaborator, entered her office carrying the latest intelligence summary. His expression conveyed both professional concern and personal frustration with their situation. Marcus had served under Sarah for 3 years and had witnessed firsthand the quality of her analytical work and leadership abilities. The dismissal at the Joint Chiefs briefing had angered him as much as it had humiliated Sarah. "Colonel, we've received confirmation from 3 separate sources about accelerated activity in the networks you've been tracking," Marcus reported, setting classified documents on her desk. "Human intelligence from Beirut indicates increased funding flowing to operational cells. Signals intelligence shows heightened communication activity, and satellite reconnaissance has identified suspicious gathering patterns at known training facilities." Sarah reviewed the reports with growing concern. Each piece of evidence supported her analysis of imminent coordinated attacks, but the evidence remained trapped within intelligence command while operational units continued their normal activities, unaware of the developing threats. The traditional military hierarchy that was supposed to protect national security had become an obstacle to effective intelligence sharing. "Marcus, has there been any response from General Peterson's office about alternative briefing options?" Sarah asked, though she suspected the answer based on Marcus's expression. "Negative, Colonel. General Peterson is scheduled to brief the Joint Chiefs next week, but he's indicated that he'll present a sanitized version of our analysis without the detailed operational intelligence you've gathered. He's concerned that pushing too hard on this issue could result in intelligence command losing credibility with senior leadership. The political calculations underlying military decision-making often frustrated intelligence professionals who dealt with life-and-death information daily. General Peterson was an excellent officer, but he was also a politician who understood that challenging the Joint Chiefs directly could end careers and reduce intelligence command's influence on future operations. Sarah understood his position, but she couldn't accept inaction when lives were at stake. Her secure phone displayed an incoming message from the National Security Agency, one of several intelligence organizations she had contacted directly over the past 3 days. While bypassing traditional military channels violated protocol, Sarah's security clearance provided legitimate access to interagency intelligence sharing networks designed to prevent information from being trapped within bureaucratic silos. The NSA response was encouraging. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, the agency's director of counterterrorism analysis, had reviewed Sarah's intelligence summary and wanted to schedule a secure video conference to discuss operational implications. Dr. Rodriguez's reputation for analytical excellence and political courage made her a potential ally in getting this intelligence to decision-makers who could act on it. "Colonel, if I may speak freely," Marcus said, closing the office door behind him, "what you're considering could end your career. Going outside military channels to share intelligence with civilian agencies will be viewed as insubordination by the Pentagon hierarchy. They'll court-martial you for this." Sarah had spent sleepless nights considering exactly those consequences. 20 years of military service would be destroyed if she continued down this path, but the alternative was watching terrorist attacks unfold while possessing information that could prevent them. The oath she had sworn as an officer required her to support and defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. Gender prejudice that prevented effective intelligence sharing seemed to qualify as a domestic threat to national security. "Marcus, I've analyzed this decision from every possible angle," Sarah replied, her voice carrying the weight of someone who had already made an irreversible choice. "If we follow proper channels, this intelligence will be diluted, delayed, and possibly dismissed entirely. By the time it reaches operational commanders, it may be too late to prevent attacks. I can't live with that outcome." The secure video conference with Dr. Rodriguez was scheduled for 1400 hours, giving Sarah time to prepare comprehensive briefing materials that could be shared with civilian intelligence agencies. Her presentation would need to be thorough enough to convince skeptical analysts while being accessible to decision-makers without military background. The stakes had never been higher in her career, Sarah spent the morning refining her analysis and preparing visual aids that clearly demonstrated the terrorist network connections she had identified. Her team contributed additional research that strengthened the overall intelligence picture, though she made it clear that she alone would take responsibility for sharing the information outside military channels. She wouldn't allow her subordinates' careers to be destroyed by her decision to challenge institutional prejudice. The video conference began precisely at 1400 hours, with Dr. Rodriguez appearing on Sarah's secure monitor from NSA headquarters in Fort Meade. 2 additional participants joined the call: James Patterson from the CIA's Counterterrorism Center, Michael Chang from the Defense Intelligence Agency. Sarah recognized this as a significant gathering of senior intelligence professionals who took her assessment seriously enough to commit their valuable time. "Colonel Mitchell," Dr. Rodriguez began, "your intelligence summary raises serious concerns about coordinated terrorist activities. Can you walk us through your analytical methodology and explain how you identified these network connections that other agencies have missed?" For the next 90 minutes, Sarah presented the most comprehensive intelligence briefing of her career. She explained her network analysis techniques, demonstrated the communication pattern recognition that revealed organizational structures, and provided detailed evidence of coordinated planning across multiple terrorist cells. Her audience asked pointed questions that revealed their own expertise and serious consideration of her findings. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Dr. Timmons. Rodriguez confirmed that NSA had detected similar patterns in their own intelligence but had not connected them to the broader network that Sarah had identified. James Patterson acknowledged that CIA human intelligence reports supported her analysis of increased terrorist activity. Dr. Chang admitted that Defense Intelligence Agency satellite reconnaissance had observed activities that fit perfectly into Sarah's operational timeline predictions. "Colonel Mitchell," Dr. Rodriguez said as the conference concluded, "this intelligence represents a significant threat that requires immediate attention from the highest levels of government. I'm prepared to brief the National Security Advisor personally, but I need your permission to attribute this analysis to you directly. Are you prepared for that level of visibility?" The question carried profound implications for Sarah's future. Attribution would ensure that her analysis received proper consideration, but it would also expose her violation of military protocol to the Pentagon hierarchy. Once senior civilian officials began acting on intelligence that had been suppressed by military leadership, the political fallout would be swift and merciless. "Dr. Rodriguez, if this intelligence can prevent terrorist attacks against American citizens, then I'm prepared to accept whatever consequences result from my actions," Sarah replied, knowing that she was crossing a line from which there would be no return. The following hours passed in a blur of activity as Sarah's intelligence was rapidly distributed through civilian intelligence networks. By 1800 hours, her secure phone was ringing with calls from the National Security Council staff, senior officials at the State Department, and the FBI's Counterterrorism Division. Each conversation confirmed that her analysis was being taken seriously at the highest levels of government. The Pentagon's response was predictably swift and punitive. General Peterson called personally to inform Sarah that she was being relieved of her current duties pending a formal investigation into her breach of military protocol. Intelligence Command was being tasked with conducting a comprehensive review of her actions, and preliminary discussions suggested that court-martial proceedings were likely. "Sarah," General Peterson said, his voice conveying personal regret even as he delivered official censure. "I understand why you did this, and I can't say I disagree with your assessment of the threat. But you violated the chain of command in a way that the Joint Chiefs can't ignore. I've been ordered to suspend your security clearance and restrict you to base until further notice." The irony was complete. Sarah's successful intelligence work had resulted in her removal from the very position that had enabled her to identify the terrorist threats. While civilian agencies acted on her analysis to prevent attacks, military leadership punished her for the sin of being right while female. The institution she had served faithfully for 20 years was destroying her career for the crime of protecting American national security. That evening, Sarah sat in her empty office, packing personal items and classified materials for transfer to her replacement. The whiteboards had been erased, the intelligence reports secured in filing cabinets, and her security access revoked. Her team of analysts would continue their work under new leadership, but the institutional culture that had rejected her analysis remained unchanged. Her reflection in the office window showed a professional military officer whose career was effectively over, but whose conscience remained clear. The terrorist attacks that her intelligence had revealed might be prevented, and ultimately that mattered more than personal consequences. Sarah had joined the military to serve her country, and she had done exactly that, even when it meant sacrificing everything she had worked to achieve. The drive home through Washington, D.C. Traffic provided time to process the day's events and consider her uncertain future. 20 years of military service was ending not with the retirement ceremony she had imagined, but with professional disgrace for the crime of being competent while female. The city lights reflected off her car windows like stars, beautiful but distant, much like the military career that was rapidly receding into her past. Her small apartment in Arlington had always been a refuge from the demands of military service, but tonight it felt like a prison. The walls displayed photographs from deployments around the world, commendations for exceptional service, and mementos from a career dedicated to protecting American interests. Tomorrow, those symbols of professional achievement would become reminders of everything she had lost for doing her job too well. As Sarah prepared for what might be her final night as an active-duty military officer, she reflected on the choice she had made and the price she was paying for challenging institutional prejudice. The terrorist network she had identified would face disruption from multiple agencies acting on her intelligence. But the military culture that had rejected her analysis would continue unchanged, ready to suppress the next female officer who dared to excel beyond prescribed limitations. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Marcus, informing her that the Joint Chiefs had called an emergency session to discuss intelligence sharing protocols and the security breach represented by her actions. The message carried an undertone of admiration mixed with concern for her welfare. Sarah's team understood what she had sacrificed to get their intelligence to decision-makers who would act on it. The last task of her military career was writing a detailed report explaining her actions for the formal investigation that would determine her legal fate. Sarah sat at her kitchen table surrounded by the same classified documents that had started this crisis, and began crafting a defense of her decision to prioritize national security over military hierarchy. The report would either vindicate her actions or provide evidence for her court-martial. But either way, she would tell the truth about institutional prejudice that threatened American security. The emergency meeting of the National Security Council was scheduled for 0600 hours, an unusual time that indicated the severity of the situation developing across multiple intelligence agencies. Sarah's analysis had triggered a chain reaction of activity throughout the American intelligence community, with each agency contributing additional evidence that confirmed the scope and urgency of the terrorist threat she had identified. By midnight, preliminary reports suggested that coordinated attacks were planned for major American cities within the next 72 hours. Doctor History. Elena Rodriguez had worked through the night preparing a comprehensive briefing that combined Sarah's network analysis with supporting intelligence from NSA, CIA, and FBI sources. The picture that emerged revealed a sophisticated terrorist operation that had been developing for over 2 years, with financial backing, logistical support, and operational coordination that exceeded anything previously observed from non-state actors. The implications were staggering and demanded immediate presidential attention. At the White House Situation Room, senior officials gathered around the secure conference table that had witnessed countless national security crises throughout American history. President Catherine Walsh presided over the meeting with characteristic calm, but her expression revealed the tension that accompanied decisions involving potential terrorist attacks on American soil. The National Security Advisor, Secretary of Defense, Director of National Intelligence, and FBI Director had all received preliminary briefings on Sarah's intelligence throughout the night. Dr. Rodriguez, President Walsh began, I understand that we have credible intelligence about coordinated terrorist attacks and that this intelligence came to our attention through unconventional channels. Please brief us on the threat assessment and the circumstances surrounding its discovery. The presentation that followed was thorough, professional, and terrifying in its implications. Rodriguez explained Sarah's analytical methodology, demonstrated the network connections that revealed terrorist coordination, and provided timeline projections that indicated attacks within days rather than weeks. The supporting evidence from multiple agencies eliminated any doubt about the credibility of the threat assessment. Madam President, the FBI director interjected, "We've already begun surveillance operations on the domestic cells identified in Colonel Mitchell's analysis. Preliminary observations confirm unusual activity patterns and communication behaviors consistent with operational preparation. We're prepared to initiate arrests within 12 hours if you authorize preemptive action." The Secretary of Defense shifted uncomfortably in his chair, clearly aware that the Pentagon hierarchy had rejected this same intelligence just days earlier. The political implications were significant. Senior military leadership had allowed gender prejudice to override national security considerations, potentially leaving the country vulnerable to terrorist attacks that civilian agencies were now racing to prevent. "Mr. Secretary," President Walsh addressed the Secretary of Defense directly, "can you explain why this critical intelligence was not shared with my administration through normal military channels? Why did a serving military officer feel compelled to bypass her chain of command to warn us about threats to American security?" The question hung in the air like an accusation, carrying implications that extended far beyond this specific intelligence failure. The entire meeting was being recorded for historical records, creating permanent documentation of military leadership's failure to properly evaluate and act upon critical intelligence. The Secretary of Defense's career and the reputation of senior military leadership hung in the balance. "Madam President, I'll need to conduct a thorough investigation before providing a complete answer to your question," the Secretary replied carefully. "However, preliminary reports suggest that there were concerns about the intelligence source and analytical methodology that led to delayed evaluation by senior military leadership." President Walsh's expression revealed her skepticism about that explanation. As a former prosecutor who had built her political career on competence and accountability, she had little patience for bureaucratic excuses that compromised national security. Her next question cut to the heart of the matter with prosecutorial precision. "Mr. Prestige, Secretary, are you telling me that senior military officials questioned the competence of a colonel who has successfully predicted 3 previous terrorist operations? Or are we dealing with institutional biases that prevented proper evaluation of intelligence analysis conducted by a female officer?" The silence that followed was deafening. Everyone in the Situation Room understood the implications of the President's question, and the Secretary of Defense's answer would determine both the immediate response to the terrorist threat and the long-term consequences for military leadership. The moment represented a crossroads between institutional prejudice and national security requirements. Meanwhile, at the Pentagon, an emergency meeting of the Joint Chiefs was underway in the same conference room where Sarah had been dismissed just days earlier. The 5 generals who had rejected her briefing now faced the uncomfortable reality that civilian agencies were acting on intelligence they had dismissed without consideration. The political ramifications were enormous, with potential congressional investigations and media scrutiny threatening their careers and reputations. General Hayes, as chairman of the Joint Chiefs, bore primary responsibility for explaining how critical intelligence had been suppressed within the military hierarchy. His decades of service and previously sterling reputation provided little protection against the magnitude of this failure. The fact that a female colonel had been ejected from the briefing for gender-based reasons rather than legitimate analytical concerns made the situation exponentially worse. "Gentlemen and General Williams," General Hayes began, his voice carrying the weight of someone who knew his career was effectively over, "we face a situation that demands immediate accountability and institutional change. Our failure to properly evaluate Colonel Mitchell's intelligence has exposed fundamental flaws in our decision-making processes that cannot be ignored or excused." General Morrison, who had led the charge against Sarah's presence in the original briefing, found himself in an impossible position. His comments about secretarial duties and inappropriate presence were being dissected by Pentagon lawyers who understood that discrimination lawsuits and congressional investigations were inevitable. The institution he had served for 35 years was preparing to sacrifice him to protect itself from broader scrutiny. "Sir," General Morrison said, his voice lacking its usual confidence, "I believe there were legitimate concerns about protocol and proper channels for intelligence briefing that influenced our decision-making process. Perhaps those concerns overshadowed the substantial content of Colonel Mitchell's analysis. General Williams, who had remained silent during the original briefing, now faced questions about her own role in perpetuating institutional discrimination against female officers. As the only woman among the Joint Chiefs, her failure to support Sarah carried additional significance and political implications. Her silence had been interpreted as acquiescence to gender-based dismissal of critical intelligence. Back at the White House, President Walsh was receiving real-time updates on counterterrorism operations that were unfolding across the country based on Sarah's intelligence. FBI raids were simultaneously targeting terrorist cells in New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, and Miami, with preliminary arrests confirming the accuracy of her analytical predictions. The operations were succeeding precisely because civilian agencies had taken her intelligence seriously enough to act quickly and decisively. Madam President, the FBI director reported via secure communication, "We've successfully apprehended 12 individuals connected to the terrorist network identified by Colonel Mitchell's analysis. Preliminary interrogations and evidence collection confirm plans for coordinated attacks on transportation infrastructure and civilian targets. We've prevented multiple simultaneous attacks that could have resulted in hundreds of casualties. The success of the counterterrorism operations vindicated Sarah's intelligence work, while highlighting the catastrophic failure of military leadership to properly evaluate and act upon her analysis. The contrast between civilian agency competence and military prejudice was stark and undeniable, creating a political crisis that demanded immediate administrative response." Dr. Rodriguez presented the final element of her briefing to the National Security Council, a detailed timeline showing how Sarah's intelligence had been developed, rejected by military leadership, and ultimately acted upon by civilian agencies. The chronology revealed a clear pattern of institutional bias that had nearly resulted in preventable terrorist attacks on American soil. Madam President, Dr. Rodriguez concluded, "Colonel Mitchell's analytical work represents the highest quality intelligence product I've encountered in 20 years of counterterrorism analysis. Her methodology is innovative, her conclusions are supported by multiple independent sources, and her predictions have proven accurate in every detail." The decision to reject her briefing appears to have been based entirely on gender prejudice rather than analytical merit. President Walsh's response was swift and decisive, reflecting both her prosecutorial background and her commitment to accountability in government service. She had built her political reputation on competence and merit-based decision-making, values that were directly challenged by the military's treatment of Sarah's intelligence analysis.
Dr. Paulina.
Rodriguez, I want Colonel Mitchell brought to the White House immediately for a personal briefing with my national security team. She's demonstrated exactly the kind of analytical excellence and professional courage that our nation needs in intelligence services. Furthermore, I'm directing the Secretary of Defense to conduct a comprehensive review of the decision-making process that led to this intelligence being rejected. The order sent shockwaves through the Pentagon hierarchy, as senior military officials realized that their careers hung in the balance of a presidential investigation into institutional discrimination. Sarah's vindication was becoming complete, but the cost to military leadership was escalating rapidly. The institution that had rejected her was now facing unprecedented scrutiny from the highest levels of government. At her Arlington apartment, Sarah received a secure phone call from the White House military office, informing her that President Walsh had requested her immediate presence for a national security briefing. The irony was overwhelming. 3 days after being ejected from a Pentagon briefing for gender-based reasons, she was being summoned to brief the President of the United States on the same intelligence that military leadership had rejected. The drive to the White House provided time for Sarah to process the dramatic reversal of her situation, but she remained focused on the immediate task of supporting ongoing counterterrorism operations. Her analysis had successfully prevented terrorist attacks, vindicating her methodology and professional judgment, while exposing institutional prejudices that threatened national security. The personal vindication was satisfying, but the broader implications for military culture remained uncertain. Security processing at the White House proceeded with efficiency befitting a national emergency, and Sarah found herself in the West Wing within hours of the initial phone call. The contrast between her current reception and the dismissive treatment she had received at the Pentagon was stark and telling. Civilian officials treated her intelligence work with the respect and attention it deserved, while military leadership had rejected it based on irrelevant personal characteristics. The Oval Office meeting with President Walsh was scheduled to last 30 minutes but extended to over an hour, as Sarah provided detailed briefings on terrorist network analysis, ongoing threat assessments, and recommendations for preventing future coordinated attacks. The president's questions revealed deep understanding of intelligence analysis and genuine respect for Sarah's professional competence. Colonel Mitchell, President Walsh said as the briefing concluded, "Your analytical work has prevented American casualties and exposed critical weaknesses in our intelligence sharing processes. You've demonstrated exactly the kind of professional excellence and personal courage that exemplifies the best of American military service. I want you to know that your actions will not go unrewarded." The conversation that followed would reshape Sarah's career and send clear messages throughout the military hierarchy about accountability, merit-based evaluation, and the consequences of institutional discrimination. President Walsh's next decisions would determine whether the Pentagon's treatment of Sarah represented an isolated incident or a broader pattern requiring systematic reform. As Sarah departed the White House, she reflected on the remarkable transformation of her situation over the past week. From professional humiliation to presidential recognition, her journey illustrated both the persistence of institutional prejudice and the power of individual courage in challenging discriminatory practices. The terrorist attacks had been prevented, her intelligence vindicated, and her career trajectory dramatically altered. The real test would come in the following days, as military leadership faced the consequences of their discriminatory decision-making and institutional culture confronted demands for fundamental change. Sarah's vindication was complete, but the broader battle for equality and merit-based evaluation in military service was just beginning. The 5 generals who had dismissed her were about to discover that their actions carried consequences, extending far beyond one colonel's wounded pride. The Pentagon's main conference room had never felt smaller as the 5 generals who had dismissed Sarah Mitchell just 1 week earlier sat in uncomfortable silence, waiting for Secretary of Defense Patricia Chen to arrive for what everyone understood would be a career-ending conversation. The morning news had already broken the story of successful counter-terrorism operations that prevented coordinated attacks across 4 major cities, with reports crediting intelligence work that had been initially rejected by senior military leadership for discriminatory reasons. General Hayes checked his watch nervously, knowing that his 40-year military career was about to end in disgrace. The same conference room where he had presided over Sarah's dismissal now felt like a courtroom where his professional legacy would be judged and found wanting. The irony was inescapable. The woman they had ejected for being female had saved American lives while their prejudice had nearly enabled terrorist attacks to succeed. Outside the Pentagon, media trucks lined the parking areas as reporters scrambled to understand how gender discrimination within military leadership had almost resulted in preventable terrorist casualties. Congressional offices were fielding calls from constituents demanding investigations into systemic bias within the defense establishment, while women's rights organizations prepared statements calling for comprehensive military reform. The story had captured national attention in ways that threatened to reshape civil-military relations. Secretary Chen entered the conference room at precisely 0800 hours, her expression conveying the controlled fury of someone who had spent the previous night explaining to President Walsh how gender prejudice had compromised national security. As the first female Secretary of Defense in American history, she understood the implications of this failure better than anyone else in the Pentagon hierarchy. Her own credibility was at stake alongside that of the institution she led. "Gentlemen and General Williams," Secretary Chen began, her voice carrying the authority of someone who held the careers of everyone present in her hands, "I have spent the past 18 hours explaining to the President, congressional leadership, and the American public how institutional discrimination nearly resulted in terrorist attacks that Colonel Mitchell's intelligence could have prevented. Each of you will now explain your role in this catastrophic failure of military leadership." The silence that followed stretched for nearly 30 seconds as each general contemplated responses that might salvage their careers while acknowledging inexcusable failures of judgment. The evidence of discrimination was overwhelming, documented in official records, and witnessed by multiple personnel who could testify about the dismissive treatment Sarah had received. Denial was impossible, but admission carried career-ending implications. General Morrison, who had led the initial dismissal of Sarah's presence, spoke first with the resignation of someone who understood that his military service was effectively over. "Madam Secretary, I made inappropriate comments during Colonel Mitchell's attempted briefing that reflected personal biases rather than professional judgment. My remarks about secretarial duties were discriminatory and prevented critical intelligence from reaching decision-makers who could have acted upon it. The admission was damning but accurate, creating permanent documentation of gender-based discrimination that would follow Morrison into civilian life. His decades of military service would be overshadowed by this single incident, but his honesty provided a foundation for institutional accountability that might prevent similar failures in the future. General Thompson followed with his own acknowledgement of failure. Madam Secretary, I questioned Colonel Mitchell's qualifications based on gender rather than analytical competence. My comments about appropriate levels of experience were discriminatory and reflected institutional biases that compromised our evaluation of critical intelligence. I accept full responsibility for my role in this failure. Each admission further documented the scope of institutional discrimination while providing evidence for the comprehensive reforms that President Walsh was demanding. Secretary Chen took detailed notes that would become part of official records, used to reshape military culture and prevent similar failures in the future. General Williams faced the most complex situation as the only woman among the Joint Chiefs, whose silence during Sarah's dismissal had enabled discrimination to proceed unchallenged. Her position carried additional responsibilities for supporting female officers and challenging institutional bias, responsibilities she had failed to fulfill when it mattered most. Madam Secretary, General Williams said, her voice carrying genuine regret, my failure to speak up during Colonel Mitchell's briefing enabled discrimination to occur without challenge. As the only woman present, I had particular responsibility to ensure that gender bias didn't influence our evaluation of intelligence analysis. My silence was inexcusable and contributed to this institutional failure. The acknowledgement was painful but necessary, highlighting how institutional pressure could compromise even those who should have been natural allies against discrimination. General Williams's position as the first woman to serve on the Joint Chiefs had required careful navigation of military culture, but her survival strategy had failed when another woman needed support most. General Chen, who had remained silent during Sarah's attempted briefing, offered his own admission of failure. Madam Secretary, I allowed personal discomfort with challenging senior colleagues to override my professional judgment about intelligence evaluation. My failure to support Colonel Mitchell's analysis contributed to a discriminatory decision-making process that compromised national security. The pattern of individual failures revealed systemic problems within military culture that enabled discrimination to flourish unchallenged. Each general had contributed to the institutional failure through action or inaction, creating a collective responsibility that demanded comprehensive accountability and reform. General Hayes, as chairman of the Joint Chiefs, bore ultimate responsibility for the leadership failure that had nearly enabled terrorist attacks to succeed. His 40 years of distinguished service provided little protection against the magnitude of this institutional breakdown. But his response would determine how the military addressed its cultural problems going forward. Madam Secretary, General Hayes said with the dignity of someone who accepted inevitable consequences, as chairman of the Joint Chiefs, I bear ultimate responsibility for the discriminatory decision-making process that rejected Colonel Mitchell's intelligence briefing. My leadership allowed institutional bias to override professional judgment and compromise national security. I submit my resignation effective immediately and recommend comprehensive reforms to prevent similar failures in the future. The resignation was expected but still carried profound implications for military leadership and institutional accountability. General Hayes had served with distinction throughout his career, but his legacy would be forever linked to this failure of judgment that had nearly cost American lives. His willingness to accept responsibility provided a foundation for institutional healing, while acknowledging the scope of necessary reforms. Secretary Chen accepted the resignation while outlining the comprehensive changes that President Walsh was demanding to address institutional discrimination throughout military services. The reforms would include mandatory bias training for all senior officers, revised promotion criteria that emphasized merit over traditional networks, and independent oversight mechanisms to prevent discrimination from influencing critical decisions. General Hayes, your resignation is accepted with recognition of your decades of distinguished service and acknowledgement that institutional change requires leadership accountability. Secretary Chen responded. The remaining members of the Joint Chiefs will participate in comprehensive reform efforts designed to eliminate gender discrimination and ensure that merit-based evaluation guides all military decisions. Meanwhile, across the Potomac River, Sarah Mitchell was meeting with President Walsh and senior White House officials to discuss her new role as Special Advisor for Intelligence Innovation, a position created specifically to ensure that analytical excellence received proper recognition, regardless of the analyst's gender, race, or background. The role would provide direct access to presidential decision-making while bypassing traditional military hierarchies that had proven susceptible to discriminatory practices. Colonel Mitchell, President Walsh said during their private meeting, "Your intelligence work prevented terrorist attacks while your personal courage exposed institutional problems that demanded immediate attention. I'm promoting you to Brigadier General and assigning you to lead comprehensive reforms of intelligence analysis throughout the defense establishment. Your experience will guide efforts to ensure that analytical excellence is properly valued and supported." The promotion represented complete vindication of Sarah's professional competence while providing her with authority to implement the changes necessary to prevent similar discrimination in the future. Her new position would enable her to reshape military intelligence culture while ensuring that analytical talent was properly recognized and utilized, regardless of personal characteristics. The White House announcement of Sarah's promotion and the resignation of the Joint Chiefs Chairman dominated national news cycles, providing clear evidence that institutional discrimination carried serious consequences, while professional excellence received appropriate recognition. Women's rights organizations hailed the outcome as a breakthrough for equality in military service, while defense analysts noted the potential for significant improvements in intelligence evaluation and decision-making processes. Congressional hearings were scheduled to examine the broader implications of discrimination within military leadership, with Sarah expected to testify about institutional barriers that prevented effective intelligence sharing. Her experience would provide crucial evidence for legislative reforms designed to eliminate bias from military decision-making while ensuring that analytical competence guided national security policy. The Pentagon's response to the crisis involved comprehensive reviews of promotion practices, briefing protocols, and decision-making processes that had enabled discrimination to compromise national security. Secretary Chen announced mandatory training programs for all senior officers, revised evaluation criteria that emphasized merit over personal relationships, and independent oversight mechanisms designed to identify and eliminate discriminatory practices. Military academies began updating curricula to address unconscious bias and institutional discrimination, while officer training programs incorporated case studies based on Sarah's experience to illustrate the national security implications of prejudiced decision-making. The cultural transformation would take years to complete, but the foundation was being established through concrete policy changes and leadership accountability. 3 months after her initial dismissal from the Joint Chiefs briefing, Sarah stood before a joint session of Congress to deliver testimony on intelligence analysis reforms and the institutional changes necessary to prevent discrimination from compromising national security. Her presence in the House chamber represented complete vindication of her professional judgment while providing a platform to advocate for comprehensive military reform. The 5 generals who had originally dismissed her were no longer in military service. Their careers ended by the discriminatory decision-making that had nearly enabled terrorist attacks to succeed. General Hayes had retired quietly, while Generals Morrison and Thompson faced ongoing investigations into patterns of discriminatory behavior throughout their careers. General Williams was participating in diversity training programs, while General Chen was leading reform efforts within the Defense Intelligence Agency. Sarah's testimony focused on the analytical techniques that had identified terrorist networks and the institutional barriers that had prevented military leadership from acting on critical intelligence. Her recommendations for reform emphasized merit-based evaluation, independent oversight, and cultural changes designed to ensure that analytical excellence received proper recognition regardless of the analyst's personal characteristics. Honorable members of Congress, Sarah concluded her testimony. The terrorist attacks we prevented could have been avoided entirely if institutional discrimination had not prevented critical intelligence from reaching decision-makers. Military service demands the highest standards of professional competence and personal courage, values that are incompatible with prejudice and bias. Our national security depends on ensuring that analytical excellence guides policy decisions rather than irrelevant personal characteristics. The standing ovation that followed represented recognition not just of Sarah's individual achievement, but of the broader principles of equality and merit that her experience had vindicated. Her badge had indeed left 5 generals apologizing, but more importantly, it had sparked institutional changes that would benefit future generations of military personnel who deserved evaluation based on their professional competence rather than their gender, race, or background. The story that began with humiliating dismissal from a Pentagon briefing had concluded with comprehensive institutional reform and personal vindication that exceeded Sarah's highest ambitions. Her courage in challenging discrimination had prevented terrorist attacks while exposing cultural problems that demanded immediate attention. The 5 generals had learned that institutional prejudice carried serious consequences, while Sarah had demonstrated that individual integrity could reshape institutional culture when supported by principled leadership. The broader implications of her experience would continue to influence military culture for decades to come, providing evidence that merit-based evaluation served national security interests, while discrimination threatened the institutional competence necessary for effective defense. Her legacy would inspire future generations of military personnel to challenge bias while maintaining the professional standards necessary for protecting American security interests around the world.